So you're looking at the loanable funds analysis graph and you're wondering how or why can the savings curve shift or the demand for investment curve shift? Well, let's take a look and understand what are the factors that can make that happen. So for this specific graph and any other graph that you can see in macroeconomics, we are using a two-dimensional graph, so it's showing the relationship between two different things. When we think about the loanable funds analysis, we're looking at the relationship between interest rates and the quantity of money that's being exchanged between these savers and borrowers. So if we say, well, the thing that's going to lead to more savings or less savings is the interest rate, well, I agree with you, but it's not going to make the curve shift, because that interest rate is already portrayed on that curve. We're already showing the relationship between interest rates and the quantity of money. So we're already showing the relationship that as interest rates are greater, people are willing to save, lend out more money because they're getting a greater return. And as from a borrower's perspective, if interest rates are greater, well, borrowers will want to demand less money. The quantity demanded at those high interest rates is lower. Well, that's already represented by the upward slope of the savings curve and the downward slope of the demand for investment curve. But you have to understand what can make this shift. Well, it has to be something else than what's represented on this graph. So for any graphs that you have, if you talk about changing something that's on the axis, it's not going to shift the curve. But if you talk about changing something outside, it's going to have the potential to shift the curve. If I think back to microeconomics with supply and demand, where we're talking about the price of the good on the vertical axis, well, if the price of the good changes, we're only moving along these curves. But if we're talking about the price of competing products, or we're talking about changes in income or changing in taste, that's going to have a possible shift of these curves. So in this class, the classic examples that we give is the things that make savings more desirable. So it could be tax advantages to saving more, such as the introduction of a tax-free savings account. Well, in the past, 5% interest that you got taxed on, well, you would only keep a portion of that. If your marginal tax rate is like 50%, you might only keep like 2.5% or a bit more percent on the amount of money that you generate. But if you could put that in an account that now has no tax on interest, well, then that's more beneficial for you. So that same 5% interest rate is like an older 10% interest rate. And in that sense, for that same 5% interest rate on the graph, you're going to have a greater supply of money, because it's as if you are earning more as if the interest rate was higher. So that's going to make it shift right. Same thing from the perspective of the borrower. If the borrower has tax credits or tax advantages from borrowing money, making whatever, like going from a situation that the spending is not tax deductible to it is, in that kind of situation, that's going to lead to a greater demand for investment. But there's other factors out there that could make people save more or save less. There could be just the general sentiment of how the economy is doing. If you think that things are not going that well, you might decide to save more money than before because you want to keep more money aside, because you don't want to spend as much, because you're not sure if you're going to have your job next year. And from the perspective of a business, well, if we have that poor sentiment, they're not necessarily going to want to borrow as much. And if there's just a ton of uncertainty in the markets, which happens sometimes when some governments decide to change like tariff policies or other kind of policies in the economy, well, in those times of uncertainty, some of businesses will just kind of pull back on some of their spending. So even if interest rates didn't change, the quantity of money borrowed in those instances would fall. And on the other hand, if we're in a booming phase where the industry that you're in is booming, it's doing really well, then for the same interest rate as before, you might decide to spend more. So there's other factors in there. You have to understand how each of these factors will lead to a potential shifting of the demand curve or the supply curve, and how that's going to have an influence on interest rates and the amount of money that's being exchanged. So just keep that in mind, that if interest rates change, we're just moving along the curves. And if these other factors, you believe that for the same interest rate as before, they will either demand more or less money, or the savers will supply more or less money for that same interest rate, well, that's going to lead to a shift. So hopefully that helps to clarify. And this same kind of logic applies to other graphs, understanding the difference between movements along the curves based on changes in the variable that's on the axis versus shifts in the curve when we're thinking about other factors coming into play. Because when we're looking at one graph, we have this two-dimensional relationship between two things, and it assumes that all the other important factors stay put. As soon as you change something else in this decision process that is very important to either the savers or borrowers in this case, well, it's definitely going to have an impact on how much money they borrow or save. So I hope that clarifies things. I'll catch you guys on the next one. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing or joining my class where I guide you to apply and expand on the information found in these videos to real life examples. Have a good day.